Good evening or afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Donovan, and I'd like to thank the Konrad Lorenz Institute and Lynn and Barbara and Philip for inviting me out to share my thoughts, at least virtually share my thoughts about Mendel's legacy in genetics education. I'm coming at this from an American perspective, but I'm hoping that some of my perspectives as an American will be valuable here at today's conference. So today I'm going to argue that genetics education needs to move beyond just teaching students about Mendelian forms of inheritance if it wants to meet or accomplish this very important goal that I have for genetics education, which is combating the spread of white supremacist misinformation online. And I realize that's a very provocative argument to make, and not just because this is the 200th anniversary of Mendel's birthday. So I'm going to take some time to unpack what I see as the flaws in American genetics education and what I think we should do about those flaws. And I'm going to use several of my studies, both published and unpublished studies, to support my argument. But before I begin, I want to share a story with you about my friend Kay. So Kay is a high school biology teacher today in the Midwestern United States. And like many teachers, she has very vivid memories of learning genetics herself. So she remembers sitting in her advanced placement biology class, multiplying fractions and drawing squares, but not fully understanding why. But most importantly, she remembers thinking to herself during the course of her learning that her genes were her destiny, that there was no escaping her family's history. And this idea that genes are destiny, several scholars within the United States and in Europe have shown that around the world, really, cross-culturally, this idea is present tacitly in the biology curriculum and sometimes very explicitly as well. And we all know that, of course, throughout history, this idea has been used for some very pernicious ends, right? So the idea of a genetic destiny was a core viewpoint in the eugenics movement. It was used as an idea to rationalize racist policies and laws during the Jim Crow era of segregation in the United States. And of course, in Europe, it was an idea that was used to justify the genocide of 6 million Jews and many other people as well. And so if we fast forward back to the present, Kay has she ended up earning a PhD in molecular biology at Stanford University, my alma mater. And despite the fact that she had spent years studying genetics, when she went to teach genetics herself as a biology teacher, she reverted to the way that she had learned genetics herself. A lot of teachers do this. They kind of use instructional models and methods and ideas that they have seen before in their own learning experiences to frame how they teach students in the present. And so Kay ends up starting to teach her students this idea that DNA was destiny. And now, deep down, Kay's years of graduate study told her that the story was far more complicated when it came to genetics, that the ideas and patterns of inheritance were very complex, yet the standards and the curriculum that she had in her classroom never really conveyed this kind of complexity to students. And so this discrepancy between what Kay knew to be true, which is that inheritance is complicated, and what she was teaching her students as truth, which is that all forms of human variability can be explained well by this Punnett square, that conflict was beginning to gnaw away at her when I first met her. And Kay was deeply worried that by teaching her students that everything boils down to single gene inheritance, she could possibly be unintentionally reinforcing or entrenching racist ideas in her students. And, given the history of how genetic concepts have been used, that worry was, not far-fetched. So I met Kay at a professional learning seminar where I work at BSCS Science Learning. We were redesigning our high school biology curriculum, and she was saying a lot of stuff that was congruent with how I thought about genetics. And so I walked up to her and I said, you know, would you be willing to do something that you might consider to be very scary, which is, would you be willing to teach your students genetics, teach kids about genetic complexity in order to challenge racially biased ideas that some of your students might have? And she said she was up for the challenge, but she had concerns, and those concerns were real. So she asked me, you know, what if by doing this, I inadvertently commit a public act of racism and I end up hurting the Black and the brown students in my classroom? And I said, I completely understand where you're coming from, and that is a real concern. But what if doing this kind of teaching didn't hurt your students? What if it actually helped them? And what if we desperately need to do this kind of teaching right now? And so you can imagine how Kay responded to my call to action. And the same argument that I made to her several years ago is the argument that I'd like to make to you today, which is that if we don't change the way we teach genetics, then we may be accelerating the spread of some cognitive forms of prejudice in our society. But if we do change the way we teach genetics, then we have this wonderful opportunity to debunk racist misinformation about genetics and vaccinate our youth against some forms of cognitive prejudice. And to do that, I think we're going to have to go beyond just teaching students about classical genetics, about Mendelian forms of inheritance, single gene traits. And, you know, just to be clear, I'm not arguing that we should stop teaching about Mendel. And I'm also not arguing that genetics education is the cause of racism in society and its only solution either. But I do think that if we reform the way we teach genetics, we do have this excellent opportunity to prevent the spread of white supremacist beliefs in our society. So the reality is many high school age students in the United States are exposed to racist misinformation online. So for example, in the United States, estimates suggest that about 3/4 of high school students are online several or more times a day on YouTube. I know this to be true because I have a 12-year-old son and he's constantly on YouTube. So 75% of the 15 million of high schoolers that are in America are online quite often. The problem is studies are now showing that exposure to racist misinformation is significantly correlated with YouTube usage. And on these websites, what we've learned over the past several years, especially because of work by Aaron Panofsky at UCLA, is that a lot of the misinformation about race and genetics online is actually coming from white supremacist communities. They're disseminating propaganda about the genetic inferiority of certain races or ethnicities. And a lot of the ideas that they're disseminating are coming from racist manifestos that are published by people who commit hate crimes. So people like Anders Breivik, who murdered 77 people in a racially motivated hate crime in Norway in 2011. So, you know, what ideas are in these racist manifestos? Because these are the kinds of things that are getting systematically communicated to adolescents online. Well, this is from Breivik's manifesto. He argues, quote, "Blue eyes and blonde hair and possibly many psychological traits almost never survive a race mixing process due to the fact that Nordic genotypes are recessive, unlike African, Arab, or Oriental genotypes, which are considerably more genetically dominant." Now, this argument right here is really queued up to resonate with how middle and high school students in the United States think about genetics. Because remember, the genetics curriculum is defined by teaching about Mendel. That is the primary form of inheritance that kids are learning about, is single gene inheritance. And so if we look at this quote, I mean, look, we have phenomena like blue eyes. Those are often passed off as Mendelian traits, even though blue eyes versus brown, even though there's not blue versus brown eyes, there's many intermediate phenotypes, and eye color is epigenetically influenced. And then we have a lot of Mendelian terminology here: recessive genotypes, genetically dominant genotypes. And so it's misinformation like this from these racist manifestos that include a lot of Mendelian ideas. This is the kind of information that high school students in America could be exposed to when they go online and they encounter white supremacist propaganda. So, 75% of kids go online several more times a day. 17% of US teens are exposed to potentially messages just like the one I showed you. So if we combine those statistics, then that suggests that roughly 13% of high school students in the United States, or about 2 million high schoolers, are exposed to arguments like the one that I just showed you sometime during the course of their high school learning experience. And to put that in perspective, that's roughly 30 students per middle and high school in the United States. However, 98% of US high school students take biology at some point during their high school career. And so this means that, since biology education is really the one place where people are formally taught genetics, that the venue of high school biology might be a really excellent place to inoculate our children against some of these ideas that are floating around online. Now, some of you might now be wondering, is this guy arguing that all we need to do is teach kids about the ABCs of genetics and they're going to be able to sniff out misinformation about race and genetics online? And, life is rarely that simple. And I see kind of three barriers that we need to overcome if we want to use genetics education toward this end. So the first is that the ideas that you need to learn, genetically speaking, to sniff out misinformation about race are quite complicated. The second is that genetics education isn't set up to teach kids about genetic complexity, at least not at the secondary level. And it's not set up to teach kids about race either. And then, even if you were to overcome those two initial challenges, you still have this third hurdle to overcome, which is, who's going to be courageous enough to do this kind of teaching and learning in their classrooms? So who's going to be like Kay? So let's tackle the first point, that genetics is complicated. So I think there's essentially 5 ideas that students need to develop an understanding of if they want to be able to sniff out misinformation about race online. And, bear with me here, because what I'm about to talk about in the next 5 minutes typically takes a high school student in one of my studies about 3 to 4 weeks to develop an understanding of. So the first idea is that 0.1% of the human genome is variable DNA that differs among individuals. That might not seem like a lot of DNA. However, there are 3 billion nucleotides in the human genome. So there's at least 3 million nucleotides of difference among different individuals. But one thing we do know is from studies of human population genetics is that when we look at those 3 million or so nucleotides that differ between people, we repeatedly find that most genetic variation occurs within continents and not across them. So I'm saying continents here because people often associate continental ancestry with race and ethnicity. In the United States, people conflate those ideas. And so Africa often stands in for Black, and Europe often stands in for white, for example. And so what we found, genetically speaking, is that if you compare the genomes of individuals of the same continent or the same race, there's a lot of variability there. And if you compare the genomes of people of 2 different races, you only get a little bit more, about 5% more difference when comparing their genomes. Now, you might be wondering, well, this 5% of DNA, that's the extra amount of variability that occurs across continents. Maybe that's the DNA that's really important. Maybe that's the difference maker for racial disparities in society, because you often hear that argument online. And my answer to that is probably not, because what we've learned over the last 20 years of genome-wide association studies is that complex human traits, which are the kinds of traits that are tied up in disparities, they typically have a very weak association with genetic variation. And furthermore, this is kind of an older idea, because people inherit their genes with their environment. This is called gene-environment correlation. Population geneticists have argued that we should be skeptical of the claim that racial disparities boil down to our genes. And that's because no one's ever done a fair scientific test, a good causal inference study to figure out if inequality is truly determined by our genes. So let's talk about these points for a little bit. So, I think if you learn these ideas, you can see the flaws in white supremacist propaganda. So a lot of white supremacists are really interested in this idea of racial purity. And the idea that, you have a racially pure group that implies that there's some kind of genetic homogeneity or uniformity within a race, right? But the science shows that 95% of genetic variation is found when you compare the genomes of individuals of the same group. So this idea of racial purity or homogeneity of a group, that idea is flawed from a scientific perspective. A lot of white supremacists think that most genetic variation occurs between racial groups, but the science shows that, while racial groups are somewhat genetically different, the human species as a whole is not well genetically differentiated. So racial groups are alike, but not the same. Again, there's only 5% of variable DNA that varies across individuals of different groups. Most variation is found within groups, not between groups. So this white supremacist idea is flawed as well. Finally, some white supremacists, they kind of think, well, at some point in the future, scientists are going to figure out there's some gene that's responsible for this trait that is implicated in this disparity. But, genome-wide association studies and a lot of studies on human variability shows that most human traits do not boil down to variation in a single gene, and that complex traits have complex explanations involving interactions between many genes and the environment. And when there's a lot of stuff we don't know quite often. So that white supremacist idea is flawed. And so what I think white supremacists are unwilling to acknowledge, or at least see, is a very simple idea that anyone who receives a high quality science education could easily understand. And it's this idea that correlation is not necessarily causation. So if we have two racial groups and they differ in their trait values, their allele frequencies, or their environmental exposures, which is often the case, if not always the case, then it's going to be very difficult to say if disparities between those groups on a trait are due to genes or the environment. And that's because no one's done a fair scientific test of the idea that inequality is, genetically destined. And that, what I mean by that is no one has, say, used gene editing technology or CRISPR to randomly knock out or insert genes that people believe are implicated in disparities, and do that in embryos and wait for those children to grow up into adults to see if any disparities between kids are genetically caused, because no one can do that. That's highly unethical. Likewise, no one has taken children, kidnapped children basically at random from their parents and randomized them into different environments to systematically control for the environment, because that study too is unethical. So there are no high quality causal inference studies that really test this claim that inequality is genetically determined. However, we do have some limited control over the social policies that guide the development of the environments that we live in. So, if you were really committed to the idea that inequality between races is genetically destined, and you're also committed to science, then the only way, one way you could conduct a fair scientific test of that idea is to basically give everyone equal access to the same environments. So let's say, for example, you eliminate all disparities in income and healthcare and housing between, say, Black and white Americans in the United States. Let's say you do that for about 400 years. If at that point in the future, there are still disparities between white and Black folk in America, then you would be in a much better position to argue that racial inequality is our genetic destiny. So really, if you're committed to hypothesis testing, then and you're really committed to the idea that racial inequality is genetic and that you can prove that scientifically, then you should want to conduct a fair scientific test and eliminate all sources of environmental variation between racial groups, because that's going to help you see the effect of genes. But, no white supremacist is ever going to tell you that racism should be eliminated. Instead, they're going to claim that inequality is natural, so there's no point in doing anything about it. And they're going to say either ironically, they're going to say this, or perhaps out of naivete, that science shows that this inequality is a genetic fact. So am I saying that kids need to learn about the ABCs of genetics? Nope. What I'm arguing is that kids need to learn about the causal and the quantitative complexities of human genetics research, And they need to learn that stuff to develop the ability to challenge the kind of flawed assumptions that are inherent in white supremacist arguments. So what I'm arguing for isn't simple, it's quite complicated. It takes a lot of time to learn. So about 3 to 4 weeks to learn all of the ideas that I just talked to you about over the last several minutes. But make no mistake about it, white supremacist communities take advantage of our ignorance because no one ever learns this stuff in school science. And because of that, we're kind of at their whim when kids go online. They could easily be persuaded. So that raises the question is like, well, what is genetics education actually doing about this problem? And if we look to the pre-war period, there's a really strong case to be made that historically, the genetics curriculum has directly contributed to this problem of white supremacist views. So this is a high school book called Biology and Human Affairs. It's a pre-war textbook. I mean, this is published during the war, but it was around before the war. And so here's what it says about race. It says, human race is a matter of biological kinship and not a place of residence. The Caucasian, Australoid, Negroid, or woolly-haired, and yellow, brown, or mongoloid are scientifically agreed upon classification systems. A biologist expects to find natural differences in people. He's prepared to find great differences in mechanical, artistic, and intellectual ability. He knows that there are innate differences in persons that cannot be removed, and that it's hard for people to become reconciled with these differences and the social and economic difficulties that rise out of them. And so therefore, an understanding of biology prepares for living more comprehendingly in the world of natural inequalities that we have and will have until all persons are born alike. So there could not be a clearer communication of a genetic argument for inequality between racial groups. And underlying this argument is an inaccurate model of human difference, which is called genetic essentialism. And genetic essentialism is a social cognitive form of prejudice. It's been studied for a long time by social psychologists, and biologists have actually, for about a half century, tried to point out its flaws as well. So going back to Dobzhansky and Mayer, and then anthropologists like Ashley Montague, and Bradford Washburn, they did a lot of work to kind of show to the scientific community that this model of human difference was scientifically flawed. Dick Lewontin's another person who did that work. So what is it? Well, genetic essentialism is this idea that there's more genetic variation between groups than there is within racial groups. So it's the idea that races don't really share much of their genetic variation. And furthermore, it's this idea that each race has its own kind of special genetic essence, its own unique set of gene variants that differentiate one group from another, and therefore make individuals of the same group highly uniform or homogeneous, hence racial purity, right? And so this model then is a very convenient explanation for racial inequality, right? Because if there's this much genetic differentiation between racial groups, then, it seems commonsensical to claim that inequalities between races in society boil down to genes as well. And, if we look in the biology curriculum today, we don't see any kind of direct communication of genetic essentialism to students, not like we did in the pre-war and wartime period. Instead, what we see is that in high school biology textbooks, race comes up in the context of monogenic diseases, the Mendelian, the traits about humans that are commonly discussed during the Mendelian genetics curriculum. So textbooks say things like this: the allele responsible for sickle cell, common among people of African descent, or cystic fibrosis, the most common fatal genetic disorder among Caucasians. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with these statements because each of those diseases do occur at a higher prevalence in each of those groups. However, textbooks don't point out that sickle cell anemia is underdiagnosed in white populations by US doctors, for example. So there are some scientific issues there. But the bigger issue that I wanted to study early on in my career was, when kids learn about these human genetic diseases and their prevalence in different races, is it unintentionally communicating genetic essentialism to kids? Because if each race gets its own special disease, then that kind of implies some kind of uniformity within a group. And if each group is getting it's a different disease, like they get different diseases that are caused by genes, Well, that clearly communicates the idea that the groups are genetically discrete categories that are non-overlapping. And it's not a big stretch for kids to infer that if races differ in their disease prevalences, that perhaps other disparities in society can also be explained by genes. And so it could be that genetic essentialism is unintentionally getting learned by students when they learn about monogenic diseases in the Mendelian curriculum. And so when I was in graduate school at Stanford pursuing my PhD in science education and my master's in biology, I conducted 3 double-blinded randomized control trials to test out this hypothesis. And the logic of those studies was like a gene knockout study. So within any single classroom, I knocked race out of the curriculum in order to study the effect that race actually has when it's left in the curriculum, which is the business as usual way that human genetic diseases are discussed in America. They're discussed in reference to race. So if we're in a classroom and we have everyone here in this lecture hall, then what I would do is I would randomly assign half of you to learn about genetic diseases in different racial groups, and then half of you learned about the prevalence of those same diseases without mentioning race at all. These are middle and high school students in the United States. All of these studies are underpowered because as a graduate student, I didn't have a lot of money to conduct really big studies. But despite that, I got the same findings in all 3 studies. So if we compare the kids in the racial condition to those in the non-racial condition, the kids who learn about genetic diseases in certain racial groups were significantly more likely to endorse the idea that races differ in intelligence and academic ability because of underlying genetic differences between races. And only kids in the racial condition would say things like this. They would say Black and Hispanic students may have genes that cause them to have a harder time learning. So those results are really problematic for a variety of reasons. There's the obvious problem of prejudice, like the increase in belief in genetic essentialism that's occurring. But then also, these textbooks are not discussing intelligence or academic ability, and yet kids are going there, right? So they're making this inference to another human trait, and that's also problematic as well. But really, we're setting these kids up to do this, right? So it's not as if kids are coming in with a racist motivation. They come into the classroom because they're really interested in figuring out their social world, and their social world in America involves race. And they know there are disparities in society, and they have all kinds of questions about how they're similar to or different from their family members. And then as they enter the biology classroom, biology teachers have this really excellent teaching strategy. They say, oh, you want to know why you look different from this person or why you're similar to that person? Well, Mendel, taught us something about this, and we can use this Punnett square right here to model how we get different genes, different versions of a gene, different alleles into the same fertilized egg. And so we kind of anchor kids on Mendel. And so that suggests potentially that Mendelian genetics education may be a part of the problem. And that's one reason why I think we need to move beyond Mendel. And instead, what I think we need to offer students is what I call humane genetics education. And humane genetics education teaches students about the complexity of inheritance in order to help kids develop the ability to refute genetic essentialist ideas and arguments and beliefs. So it is learning about the complexity of genetics for an anti-essentialist purpose. So what that means is kids develop accurate models for describing and explaining human variability. And then they take that learning and they use those models to criticize the models that are used in genetic essentialist arguments. And I've done a variety of different field experiments testing out the impacts of a humane genetics education. And the most recent study that we just completed, we haven't published this yet. We have about 1,000 students in 7th to 12th grade. They're mostly high school students. They're nested within 51 classrooms and 15 teachers. And this is a geographically diverse sample of students from many different parts of the United States, the West Coast, the East Coast, the Midwest, the Intermountain West. And kids learn genetics for 28 days. And this is a crossover trial. So basically the way this works is we survey kids, and then half of the classrooms get their business as usual Mendelian genetics unit of instruction. And the other half of classrooms get a humane genetics unit of instruction. And then we survey pre-post, and then we flip it. So if you learn Mendel first, then you get humane genetics. And if you got humane genetics, then you get Mendel. Then we survey a third time. So this is a within teacher cluster randomized trial that involves a crossover trial as well. So what did we find? Well, what do we measure? So we measured on those surveys students' knowledge of complex forms of inheritance, their belief in genetic essentialism. Then we also measured the extent to which students were willing to use genes or the environment to explain racially stereotyped traits. So traits like athleticism and science ability, which in the United States are stereotyped as racially specific traits, kind of. So what do we find? Well, when we look at impacts on knowledge, what we see is that at the start of the experiment, kids in both experimental arms, they don't differ in their knowledge of genetic complexity, and they have below average knowledge of genetic complexity. And then the kids who get humane genetics, they increase significantly more in their knowledge of genetic complexity relative to the kids who are getting Mendel. Then the two groups are significantly different. And then the second half of kids get humane genetics, and they grow significantly more in their knowledge of genetic complexity relative to the kids who are now getting Mendel. Then at the end of the experiment, both groups of students have significantly greater, above average, in fact, knowledge of genetic complexity, and that's greater than where they started at the beginning of the experiment. If we look at genetic essentialism, we see the mirror opposite pattern of results. So students in the two conditions don't differ in their belief in genetic essentialism at the start of the experiment. The kids who get humane genetics, they decline significantly more in genetic essentialism relative to the kids who get Mendel. Then the two groups are significantly different from one another. Then the second half of students or classrooms, get treated with humane genetics, and they decline significantly more in their belief in genetic essentialism relative to the kids who are now getting Mendel. And at the end of the experiment, all the students have significantly lower belief in genetic essentialism compared to where they started at the beginning of the study before they started learning genetics. Now, if we look at students' explanations for racially stereotyped traits like athleticism and science ability, we see really interesting results. So first thing I want to point out, we have genetic explanations on the left, and we have environmental explanations on the right. And you will notice that these are, again, mirror opposite findings, right? So on the genetic side of the equation, humane genetics is causing a reduction in genetic explanations for racially stereotyped traits. And it's also causing a statistically significant increase in environmental explanations for racially stereotyped traits. However, I want to point out this really important finding, which is the students who get humane genetics first and Mendelian genetics second. That's what we're looking at right now. That's highlighted. The kids who get Mendel second, they show a slight increase in genetic explanations and a slight decrease in environmental explanations at the end of the experiment. And those are statistically significant effects. So even after students have received humane genetics, if they return to Mendel, we're still seeing an increase, arguably, in prejudice that we're picking up on these instruments, which are perhaps a little bit more sensitive to prejudice. Now, these results aren't flukes. They're consistent with 3 previous field experiments that my lab has conducted and published over the last several years. Some of these are randomized control trials. Some of these are quasi-experiments. But what I think these findings mean altogether is that humane genetics is a relatively reliable and safe tool for preventing the development of belief in genetic essentialism. However, humane genetics is probably most safely implemented after students have already learned Mendelian genetics. And that's why I think we need to move beyond Mendel. The story of genetics education can't begin and end with Mendel alone. So if you take my argument to be correct, if you've been persuaded, then the next question that naturally would arise in your mind is, well, great, who's going to be courageous enough to do this kind of teaching? Who's going to move beyond Mendel and offer their students a more humane genetics education? So that kind of raises the question, well, how did it go for Kay? Kay was worried about committing a public act of racism in her classroom. And, I can't stress enough how courageous Kay was to do this kind of teaching, because students in her classroom have family members who are in the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. So this is not normal teaching, right? It's stressful and overwhelming for teachers. Nevertheless, when Kay finished implementing the unit on humane genetics, she texted me and told me it was a huge rush to do this kind of teaching. And that's the kind of thing that you say when you've been preparing for a big, scary challenge, and you overcome that challenge because you've trained a lot and practiced a lot, and then you have this sense of relief. So how did Kay prepare for this kind of teaching? Well, she attended my Professional Learning Institute, which I hold in the summer for teachers. It's a 40-hour professional development institute. Teachers learn with the student materials that they're going to be implementing in their classrooms, because they haven't learned these ideas often in the past. They learn to set up a safe classroom environment so that students can do this kind of learning, and they learn how to check in with kids who might look defensive or scared or nervous, because this kind of teaching is emotionally and socially complex. It makes your identity salient while you're learning, and that usually creates a lot of identity threat. So they learn how to deal with that and how to make kids feel safe. They learn how the intervention materials work, what the instructional frameworks are, and how they're designed to promote a conceptual change in genetic essentialist beliefs. And then they also learn about research on genetic essentialism, on prejudice and its development in adolescence. And that kind of preparation is designed to have an impact on students through preparing teachers for this really daunting task of doing this kind of teaching. And so, Kay told me that because she had learned as a student herself and debriefed the intervention extensively, that she felt confident about the content she was teaching, and then many of the questions and concerns that students might have while learning this material in the class. And so I think Kay had a real significant impact on her students. So in fact, here's an email from a parent sent Kay an email after the unit concluded. And the parent said to Kay, I thought you might like to know that my son said that your class changed the way he perceives the world, and he's not entirely comfortable with that, which is, music to your ears if you're a teacher. As a social scientist, I want to quantify that impact. And so I'm really interested in understanding, how many students need to receive humane genetics to create one wholesale conceptual change. And so how many kids need to receive humane genetics to take one kid and turn them from believing into not believing in genetic essentialism? And that's called the number needed to treat. And I don't have the time to get into how it's calculated. But what we found is that for every 12 students who receive humane genetics, one additional student moves from believing to not believing in genetic essentialism. So in a classroom of 30 students, on the basis of these findings, we would predict that 2 students would go from believing to not believing genetic essentialism. So if all 15 million high schoolers in the United States received humane genetics next year, then on the basis of these findings, we would predict that about 1.2 million of those students would move from believing to not believing in genetic essentialism. And that is 65% of the total estimated population of high school students who are exposed to racist misinformation online at some point during their high school career. So if we want to achieve this kind of broad impact, then we need to do a lot of work. We need a lot more research about how to improve this kind of teaching and learning. We need new standards and new curriculum, because right now the standards in the curriculum are largely focused on teaching kids about Mendel, and certainly not teaching kids about genetics to refute genetic essentialism. Same goes with teacher education courses. It requires 40 hours of coursework to get teachers to achieve these results. So we need new teacher education programs. And we also, most importantly, need a lot of public support to do this work. And that public support is very hard to come by in the United States right now, because school boards and state legislatures are passing lots of laws that curtail how teachers can talk about race in school. But let me be clear, if we don't do anything about this, then what we're basically doing is we're allowing for the spread of misinformation about race and genetics online, like a virus. Every day, white supremacist communities are extremely effective at doing this. They have systems to communicate ideas to high school age students online. And genetics education is really the only place that we have a chance to systematically inoculate our youth against this viral misinformation. And so that's why I want to move genetics education beyond Mendel, because I think it could help us put an end to genetic misinformation about race. So thank you very much for your time. I really wish I could have been in the audience to field questions. So please reach out to me if you'd like to talk more, or you can visit my lab's website that has a lot more information on our research and our materials. So thank you and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye.